Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and today I'm going to be taking a trip down memory lane on a game from Atari, and I'm going to be doing that a few times this year as 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of Atari Inc. And so figured might as well focus a few times on different memories from games that are from that company. And I have a few of them, but some of them I don't have anymore, or some that I've never owned. They released quite a few. I'm not going to cover all of them, of course. There's too many games for any of that, but either way, since I have Crystal Castles from 1983, figured I might as well jump into that and show you various aspects of this, talk a little bit about its history, show some gameplay. I'll use a little bit of an emulator here from the Atari Anthology on the old Xbox, since I have that sitting around. And so, yeah, let's get into it. As mentioned, 2022 marks 50 years since Atari was founded. This company would directly influence video games and essentially give us the industry as we know it today. No, they didn't invent the video game, which one of their ads once claimed, but they popularized it with games like Pong, Tank, Breakout, and many others through the 1970s and 80s. Since this video is about Crystal Castles, I'll avoid talking about the great game Crash in detail, as that really could occupy an hour or two long video in itself. Suffice it to say, Crystal Castles came about during a rocky time for the company, who was essentially rudderless and hemorrhaging cash and employees. Crystal Castles was designed by a team of 8. John Ray, who would later produce San Francisco Rush, he was the team leader. Scott Fuller was the project leader. Franz Lanzinger was the programmer, with Barbara Singh and Dave Ralston on graphics. Sam Lee was the hardware designer, with Paul Mancuso and Gardner Crosby as technicians. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. The game had originally started as a variation of Asteroids, with its working title being Toporoids. The idea was to have an isometric 3D maze for the terrain, and the player would go around shooting the asteroids in this sort of maze thing. The problem was it wasn't terribly fun and just didn't play very well. Eventually the shooting component was scrapped, and in its place it became about collecting gems. The player character changed from a one-legged robot to an ET-like alien, and then to a lovable, fluffy teddy bear. First, the character would be known as Braveheart Bear, but then Atari decided to go with Bentley Bear. While Atari games had not often been known for having characters, with some exceptions being games like Adventure, Yard's Revenge, and Centipede, Crystal Castles was packed with personality. It didn't just have Bentley, but a cast of villains including gem eaters, a dancing skeleton, a swarm of bees, and an evil witch named Berthilda, these being inspired by the classic film The Wizard of Oz. Well, this was all before video game companies had expected to have a mascot of a sort, although it is surprising that Atari wouldn't think of Bentley Bear as being their mascot in later years, when the Tremills were scrambling trying to find a mascot to compete with Mario and Sonic. I guess a bear was thought of as being too cute, especially after things like Care Bears and Teddy Ruxpin. That said, Atari did try to have a mascot in the early 80s with Commander Champion, who starred in the game Liberator, as well as in Star Raiders, and he was the protagonist in the comic series Atari Force, but that was another mascot that kind of went nowhere. Crystal Castles was released in July 1983, but that wasn't a great year for selling new games due to the aforementioned game crash. That said, it was the third best-selling title from the company, selling about half as many cabinets as Star Wars, and selling just a few hundred less than Xevious. It outsold titles like Food Fight, Arabian, Major Havoc, and even Pole Position 2, although to be fair, it did cost $1,000 less than Pole Position 2 did. Crystal Castles is one of the most interesting upright cabinets to come along in the 80s, in part due to the fact that it's covered in artwork, but also thanks to the uniquely shaped marquee and lighting system. This exact design is an evolution of the Millipede cabinet, but it wasn't reused in many other titles, the only other one being Cloak and Dagger, which was also released in '83. Thanks to Atari's internal art department, they were able to put out high-quality artwork, and it really shines with this cabinet. The only detriment here being that my cabinet's almost 40 years old, and has seen some action through the decades. Even the front where the coin door is at has art, which is also unusual for cabinets of the era. The upright came with a 19-inch CRT and a single trackball, although by alternating turns it supports 1 or 2 players. The game was also produced in a cocktail model, although that is much harder to come across than the upright cabinet that you see here. Back in the early days of arcades, the computers that ran the games often looked like this, integrated the CPU, RAM, graphics hardware, and I/O chips into one board. Of course, there were many games that had to use stacks of these PCBs, but in the case of Crystal Castles, it's just this one. All of these PCBs were manufactured in California, with components often being placed there by hand. For Crystal Castles, the hardware didn't have any kind of cool code name to it. It was just the 6502 color raster board. Really exciting. Lots of unreleased games used similar hardware, but a few other released games such as Sprint 4, Liberator, and Cloak and Dagger also used it, and as mentioned, Cloak and Dagger would reuse the Crystal Castles cabinets. This board used a single 6502 running at 1.5 MHz, this being the same CPU that powered many other arcade games and several home consoles. To the left of it on the board, there are 2 Pokey audio chips. Pokey was Atari's audio chip that was also used in a lot of arcade games. It was used in their 8-bit line of home computers and the Atari 5200 console. Over on the right, you have the game's ROMs, which contain the graphics and logic code. Here that are integrated circuits, or ICs, which were pretty much the graphics card portion, with one of those chips being dedicated to vertical scrolling. Further left, you find the RAM chips. It came with 64 kilobytes of RAM split between 4 16 kilobyte chips. The schematics also mention a couple of static RAM chips, although it doesn't say how much storage space they had. Then over near the connector side, you have the I/O chips, including one made for handling the trackball specifically. The rest of the chips do have their functions, but we don't need to get into all that. The game connected to the controls and video through Atari's own wiring standard. The popular JAMA wiring standard that you probably heard of wouldn't come along for a few more years. Now we get to the game itself. When you start, the game draws the castle, then fills in Bentley and the gems. Enemies pop up a moment later. There are 37 castles in the game, with 4 castles to a stage, the exception being the final castle, which is a stage in itself. The game also cycles through color schemes on levels 2 through 6, with it changing up once every 100 plays. It makes it one of the more colorful games of the era, and that idea of changing the whole color scheme of everything was designed to surprise regular players who would come back to it often. The goal of each level is to collect all of the gems, which is made easy thanks to the trackball controller. You can really zip along the levels. The only problem is that sometimes you might be too fast, and you can run into an enemy if you're not careful. Touching an enemy will take a life, where Bentley will say one of 4 things and a little bubble above his head when he dies. And there are 2 exceptions to which enemies you can touch. One is when the centipede-like gem eaters are eating a gem, where you'll see one of their segments turn red. You can touch them then and kill them to get points. And you can also kill Berthilda if you're wearing the magical hat. Otherwise, all the enemies in the game are invincible, and the only other exception to something is where you can jump over trees to stun them temporarily, but you still shouldn't touch them. Sometimes a honeypot appears on a level. While grabbing it will nab you a bonus, it's not without some danger. A swarm of bees will appear near the pot to protect it, hanging around for a time, then disappearing for a few seconds. You need to time it just right to grab it without getting caught. Note that enemies will also be grabbing gems as they go. To get the most points, you want to pick up the very last gem for a bonus. Graphically, this certainly looks aged by today's standards, but for 1983 it was top of the line. Isometric graphics were still a new idea, having been tried out before just some months prior with Sega's Zaxxon. But I think with this game the perspective didn't hinder gameplay like it could at times in Zaxxon. The pseudo 3D look attracted players, as did the vibrant colors for the theme. There isn't a ton of music, but there is some which will play generally in between levels and on the high score screen, etc. If the tunes sound familiar, it's because they're all taken from classical music works such as Beethoven or Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and a few other classics. Now, one cool thing are some of the hidden things that are built into the game, such as the warp system. So if you want to warp ahead, the hidden warps are placed in the game generally in these points in the upper corner of the screen that's going to be obscured by the castle. So like on level 1, you go all the way to the back corner and then jump. It'll then warp you ahead, and there are some other warps in the game as well. And I believe I've read before, I've never tried this, but if you do some warps, enough warps in the game, then it unlocks an Easter egg that says Atari all over the screen. And also hidden throughout the game are various initials, and those are from people who worked on the game or were the designer Franz's friends. Whomever takes the top score has their initials carved into the first level, which is a really nice touch too. It's something that I wish that more games would have that sort of creative idea behind them. The leaderboard has spaces for 32 positions, players entering their initials with the trackball, so it's pretty easy. The game also has an ending, something rather unusual for Atari and other games of the era. Now, Crystal Castles is a somewhat tough game, and I'm certainly out of practice with it, as you've probably noticed. But if you enjoy collecting and maze games like Pac-Man, then you'll probably find plenty to like here, since it's quite creative with how it presents things. The trackball really helps it stand out and shows that it's a great controller for certain types of games, almost like the turbo mode in Miss Pac-Man that a lot of people love. Now, this game saw very few ports to consoles, with a ho-hum Atari 2600 version and later a solid version done for the Atari XEGS. Franz was not consulted on the ports, which was so often the case in the home ports between the arcade and the consumer divisions, and that annoyed him, as he felt that he could have made the 2600 port in particular much better. At the very least, though, if you had the Atari 2600 trackball controller, it worked to bring that part of it close to the arcade, but not for the other ports. And there was an Atari 5200 trackball controller, which is often well liked, so it's kind of surprising that they didn't port it to that system. It was also ported to numerous computer platforms, including the Atari 800, the Atari ST, the BBC Micro, the Apple II, the Commodore 64, the Amstrad CPC, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and the Tandy computer. And of course, it's been on tons of different Atari arcade compilations over the years for PC. Out of all those ports, the Atari ST was the only 16-bit port, and it came the closest to the arcade original, but it was running at a higher resolution, so in some ways it kind of looks better. The only issue was the choppier animation, but overall it's a great port. There are rumors of an Atari 7800 port, but they've never been confirmed, although a few years back there was a homebrew effort called Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest, and this was designed in the style of Sega's Wonder Boy 3, and it gave the Atari 7800 a platformer, which is something that almost didn't exist on the system other than a game called Scrapyard Dog. And back in the days when it was competing head-to-head with the NES, which was loaded with platformers, well, that's what fans wanted back then. And so it's actually considered to be one of the best titles on that system, so if you're into Crystal Castles in any way, shape, or form, don't overlook it. So overall, that is Crystal Castles by Atari Inc., and again released in 1983. And so if you enjoyed this, let me know in the comments below, and be sure to also leave me a comment as to what other Atari games you might like me to cover throughout this year. I'm also going to be looking at some of the Atari Recharged games that have been coming out, which are remakes of arcade classics and comparing them with their arcade brothers. And so, again, thanks for watching this. Stay tuned for more arcade goodness on this channel, and we'll see you around.